Historically, the United States of America is known as a beacon of hope, liberty, happiness, and independence for all who choose to pursue it, except for one particular group. We are going to take a look at 10 black towns that once staked their claim for independence and self-sufficiency, but was thwarted by predatory policies, economic strangulation, and horrific acts of violence, including the only bombing to ever take place on American soil. Number 10. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. January 6, 2021. More than 2,000 angry and violent citizens protested the results of the 2020 presidential election by turning their ire towards the epicenter of the United States, the U.S. Capitol building. That day resulted in the death of 5 people, and 174 police officers were injured, but the insurrection was thwarted.
I take full responsibility. It's not my fault that he came here.
That violent coup wasn't successful, but in 1898, it was. Almost 30 years after the end of the Civil War that put whites and blacks on the front lines against each other, Wilmington, North Carolina stood as an early example of what could happen if they worked together. The Republican Party of Wilmington consisted of black aldermen, elected auditors and financiers, deputy clerks, superintendents. Even Republican President William McKinley named a black man, John C. Dancy, the U.S. Collector of Customs at the Port of Wilmington. During this time, the Democratic Party was the home of white supremacist ideals. It was also home of the terrorist organization Ku Klux Klan and the paramilitary group the Red Shirts. As the resentment of black progress among the Democratic ballooned, more equity shifted. After losing the election of 1896, the Democratic Party spent the next 2 years with one goal in mind: destroy black affluence, their weapon of choice, the media. Democrats used local newspapers to run articles of divisiveness and stoke the fear of black dominance. It started by claiming blacks would take economic control by depriving its white counterparts of work, even though blacks were the minority in the workforce by a substantial margin. The claims became even more sinister and salacious. Articles and cartoon depictions began to circulate, insinuating black power meant putting white women in danger. When voting days finally came, to ensure victory, the paramilitary arm of the Democrats were sent to booths to ensure no black people would even get a say who would be in office. The Democrats won by a landslide, claiming every available position up for election. But the mission was not to eliminate blacks in power, it was to eliminate black affluence. The Democrats declared the White Declaration of Independence. We will no longer be ruled or ever ruled again by men of African origin. The Declaration aimed to strip black men of all voting rights, replace every prominent position held by a black man with a white man, and strip any other economic foothold African Americans held in the state. The next morning, hundreds of armed white men set fire to the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in Wilmington. Later, armed white men gathered at City Hall and intimidated every remaining Republican official into resigning. All vacated positions were then replaced by newly elected Democrats. By nightfall, 2,000 armed, angry white men gathered to finish the mission. Upwards to 100 black residents were killed, while others hid out in the neighboring swamp and cemetery. Thousands of African Americans escaped, never to return to Wilmington again. This marked the first and only successful insurrection in America's history. Our next 2 examinations of black towns take us out west. Number 9. Santa Monica, California. The Great Migration of African Americans leaving the South to escape Jim Crow segregation usually talks about them migrating to the East Coast and Midwest, but some escaped to the Golden State, California. The city of Santa Monica is the first African American settlement to be a seaside community. Lured by employment opportunities, beautiful landscapes, and great weather, Southern California in general became a popular destination for those seeking a better life. But the black neighborhoods in Santa Monica helped establish the beach community as we know it today. Between the 1920s and 1970s, African Americans established themselves as mainstays within the city. They taught themselves how to surf, established themselves as entrepreneurs and community leaders, and brought with them jazz music. However, they may have escaped Jim Crow segregation, but they didn't escape overt racism. Today, California is known as a place of liberation, a place where dreams come true and you can be whoever you want to be. But that was not the case for African Americans during the 20th century. As more and more migrants made their way into Santa Monica, elected officials created policies that denied them access to the city's resources. In 1922, Santa Monica created its first zoning ordinance, an adoption that denied building permits to a group of wealthy African Americans looking to establish a bathhouse. They even extended the ordinance to shut down a popular black-owned jazz club. Zoning ordinances coupled with racist real estate covenants kept black people locked into one section of Santa Monica, the Pico Corridor. Outside of Pico, black residents could not operate business, nor rent or own housing. The segregation in Santa Monica even extended to the beach. What was known as the Caucasian Clause prevented the leasing, sale, or occupation of oceanfront properties to African Americans. This clause protected sections of Santa Monica's public beaches from black visitors. The segregation of the beaches only allowed black beachgoers to enjoy a section of the beach known as the Inkwell. The discriminatory housing policies and political crimes against black people crescendoed into the 1950s and 60s with urban development. The Pico neighborhood was split in half with the development of the Interstate 10 freeway. It drove a stake through the heart of the black community, making it an undesirable place to live, displacing half the residents and destroying local businesses. At number 8, Allensworth, California. Just 2 hours north from Los Angeles, Allensworth, California, is the oldest black town in California's history. Colonel Allen Allensworth, a born slave, rose to prominence as the highest-ranking black officer of his time. After his retirement in 1906, Allensworth and a fellow comrade, William A. Payne, helped establish the California Colony and Home Promoting Association. Inspired by Booker T. Washington's message of economic self-sufficiency, the association purchased 20 acres of land with the sole intention of establishing a town for black soldiers, where they could control their own destiny. By 1910, Colonel Allensworth had officially established the land as Allensworth. The municipality was perfectly placed between Los Angeles and San Francisco. African Americans started farms devoted to sugar, wheat, barley, and cotton. Allensworth benefited greatly from an adjacent stop of the Santa Fe Railroad. Because of that, many travelers were able to purchase goods and services from the businesses of the town. For several years, Allensworth was a utopian community for African Americans looking to escape the ills of racism and segregation, a place where they could truly control their own destiny. Allensworth became home to California's first African American school district. It also had its own courthouse, hotel, and library. But the utopia was short-lived. In 1914, Colonel Allensworth died. He was struck by a motorcycle while crossing the street. Without the guidance of their leader, Allensworth couldn't withstand the onslaught of what came next. In a profound act of economic punishment, the Santa Fe Railroad Company diverted trains away from Allensworth, building a new stop in a neighboring town. The town then experienced a devastating drought. Originally, a deal had been made with the Pacific Farming Company to build enough wells. The farming company reneged on the deal, and without enough capital and other resources needed to drill their own wells, Allensworth agricultural suffered. By 1920, the utopian dream was another American nightmare for the residents of Allensworth. Our next black town was so famous that they made a movie inspired by it. Nestling at number 7, Rosewood, Florida, 1923. Rosewood, Florida is just 2 hours south of the state's capital, a small town that initially attracted both black and white people. But by the turn of the century, as jobs and resources left, so did its white settlers. By the early 1920s, Rosewood had become a small haven for black people in the Jim Crow South. 2 black families sat at the head of Rosewood, the Goins and the Carriers. The community became so tight-knit that at one point everyone was somehow related to one another. The black residents of Rosewood couldn't vote because of segregation laws, but they still thrived as a community. There were several churches, a sugarcane mill, a school, and they even had their own baseball team, the Rosewood Stars. They even had 2 convenience stores, including John Wright's General Store, which was white-owned. By all accounts, the relationship between the black residents of Rosewood and their neighboring white counterparts was amicable until 1923. It was New Year's Day when everything fell to absolute pieces. Fannie Taylor was a white young married mother who lived just across the street in nearby Sumner. Her husband was away at work when neighbors responded to hearing screams coming from the Taylor home. Fannie was found beaten and assaulted, and her alleged assailant, a black man. The county sheriff assembled a posse to launch an immediate investigation, deputizing as many as 400 volunteers to search for the assailant who allegedly made his way into Rosewood. First, a mob of 150 men arrived at the home of Aaron Carrier. Reports say he was pulled from his home, tied to the back of a car, and dragged to the police station. The next victim was Sam Carter, a local worker at the turpentine mill. He was tortured, mutilated, and executed. His body hung as a warning to anyone who could be housing the alleged fugitive. However, the people of Rosewood would not be intimidated. For the next several days, the residents of Rosewood defended their homestead. Led by Sarah and Sylvester Carrier, they exchanged shots with incoming vigilantes who tried to intrude on their property. Others ran for safety, hiding away the children in nearby swamps. As the battle raged on, newspapers reported the event as a race war, encouraging others from all over to bear down on the small town. In the end, the Carriers were overwhelmed. Eyewitnesses claim 150 black people were killed, most of them unarmed. Those white travelers who missed out on the shootout razed what was left of Rosewood by setting fire to every school, church, and place of business, except John Wright's general store. Have you heard about any of these historical black towns before? Comment below. This next community on our list were the recipients of the only airplane bombing to take place on American soil. At number 6, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1985. The Liberty Bell is an iconic symbol of independence and is located just 17 minutes east of one of the worst attacks on people seeking their own independence. MOVE was founded in 1972 in Philadelphia by John Africa. Their unique philosophy blended nature laws, anarcho-primitivism, and advocacy for animal rights. Every member of MOVE took on the last name Africa as dedication to their mother continent and adopted a Rastafarian tradition of allowing their hair to dreadlock. The community believed in the rights of all living things, often conducting nonviolent protests against the mistreatment of animals in the form of puppy mills, zoos, and circuses, and the mistreatment of people in the wake of the 3 Mile Island, industrial pollution, and police brutality. The group became known as part Black Power and part Flower Power. However, their opposition to fully participating in the societal norms of city living didn't go over well with neighbors, local politicians, or the Philadelphia Police Department. After a series of complaints from their neighbors, the Philadelphia Police Department obtained a court order to force MOVE to evacuate their current dwellings and surrender all weapons. In August of 1978, the Philadelphia police and members of MOVE engaged in their first deadly altercation. In the end, 1 police officer was gunned down. As a result, 9 members of MOVE were convicted, each sentenced to 100 years apiece. By 1985, the people of MOVE had reestablished themselves in a row home on Osage Avenue. The group continued their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, homeschooling, and composting, much to the dismay of their neighbors. This time, Philly's first black mayor, Wilson Goode, gave the order to evict MOVE. Sadly, this time was even more deadly. Not for the police, though. This time, the people of MOVE were met by the full force of the Philadelphia police. Thousands and thousands of rounds of bullets were fired into the row house. The people of MOVE were overwhelmed as they tried to protect the women and children huddled inside. Then, in an act never seen before or since, the unthinkable happened. A C-4 bomb was dropped from a Philadelphia police helicopter. The bomb completely leveled the home and left 2 blocks worth of devastation. In total, 6 adults and 5 children of MOVE were killed. They were the victims of the only sanctioned bombing on American soil. Number 5. Overtown, Miami, Florida. When oil and rail tycoon Henry Flagler needed a place for his black construction workers to live, the city of Miami designated a small district right outside of downtown. This part of Miami became known as Colored Town and later named Overtown. In the separate but equal Jim Crow South, Overtown became a haven for black people. It was home to South Florida's first high school designated for African Americans, and home to one of America's first black millionaires, D.A. Dorsey. During the 1940s, Overtown was named the Little Broadway of the South. It became a refuge for black mainstream entertainers who would perform at classic white establishments like the Fontainebleau and Eden Roche, but were not allowed to lodge there. On any given night, you could catch Billie Holiday, Jackie Robinson, Nat King Cole, or Joe Louis strolling through Overtown. However, Overtown would become a victim of economic deprivation. As the city of Miami grew, they built highways and an expressway over the town. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave way to other places for African Americans to take their homes, commerce, and businesses. At its peak, Overtown was a thriving hub of roughly 50,000, but by the 1980s, it became economically destitute and home to only 10,000. Our next black town isn't as well known as what replaced it. Number 4, Seneca Village, New York. Central Park, one of the most famous parks in the world, the home of runners, family picnics, and countless famous movie scenes. A must-see for people visiting New York. But did you know Central Park was once the home of a black town? Seneca Village was founded in 1825 by free black Americans. In 1 week, a 25-year-old African American named Andrew Williams and members of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church purchased in total 21 lots from the previous owner, a white farmer. After slavery was abolished in New York State, Seneca Village welcomed more immigrants. Later, the Great Famine of Ireland brought in a new marginalized group, the Irish. Despite their cultural differences and social conflicts, the Irish and blacks lived alongside each other in the village. At its peak, Seneca Village was a bustling community of middle-class blacks and working-class Irishmen, 3 churches, 2 schools, 2 cemeteries, and almost 400 people. At the time, it was one of the only places African Americans could buy land and exist free of harassment and discrimination. However, black prosperity would not last long. In 1857, the government of New York State enacted eminent domain, a practice in which private property is seized in order to create land for public use. Seneca Village thus became Central Park. We're getting into our top 3, and believe me, you'll want to smash that subscribe button for more. Now, let's move on to number 3. At number 3, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the capital city of America and the most powerful city in the world, but at one point, it was known as the Chocolate City. As the South continued to enact stricter laws and segregation practices, many blacks migrated north as part of the Great Migration in search of better education, job opportunities, and a way to escape legal lynchings. The capital became a popular landing place. In D.C., African Americans thrived, establishing several neighborhoods, a myriad of thriving businesses, and established the first black high school in America, Paul Laurence Dunbar Senior High School. They even had their own baseball team, the Homestead Grays of the Negro League. D.C. established itself as a place where black politicians, entertainers, and activists could all gather. By 1950, with 35% of its residents identifying as black, a white exodus to the suburbs of Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland began. Less than a decade later, Washington, D.C. was declared the first major American city to be majoritively black. For years, the black citizens of D.C. continued to build and expand. Out of it came historical destinations like the U Street District, the mighty Howard University, thriving enclaves, museums, and schools. The black Washingtonians even created their own Grammy Award-winning music genre, go-go. But in the heart of politics, the Chocolate City would be melted down. Decades of policies that impacted black residents, including excluding job opportunities, unfair wage practices, and deceitful housing and banking tactics. Years of turmoil and chaos brought on by the war on drugs left many black residents dead and imprisoned, leading to fractured homes and decimated neighborhoods. The final nail in the coffin came with urban renewal plans during the early millennium. It enticed those who fled to the suburbs to come back to the city. Eventually, historically black neighborhoods were overtaken by gentrification, leading to an exodus of black people who had been priced out. In 2020, for the first time in almost 70 years, black residents no longer were the majority. Number 2, Harlem, New York. Nothing epitomized the combination of black affluence and art like Harlem during the early 20th century. Fueled by not only the great migration of blacks from the South, but Harlem welcomed immigrants from the West Indies. This mixture of black cultures created a stew of new fashion trends, music, and art, and eventually became known in the history books as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem was unique in the sense it didn't hide or steer clear of white America. Instead, it influenced America and the world. Harlem controlled its own narrative as they housed their own publishing houses, newspapers, and music companies. Their nightclubs, playhouses, and cabarets were solicited by celebrities, socialites, and dignitaries from all over the world. Harlem represented an overt racial pride in what many deemed the new Negro. African Americans like Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, Zora Neale Hurston, and Langston Hughes finally had a place to proudly produce their own art, music, and literature and be seen as intellectual. They showcased their ability to rock furs, jewels, dance the night away, and still fight against pervading racism, promote socialist politics, all with a spirit of self-determination. The neighborhood was also home to black activism. Marcus Garvey lived and launched his Back to Africa movement in Harlem. Later, Harlem became a hub during the civil rights movements and the home of black nationalist groups. Famously, the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7, which was run by Malcolm X. At its pinnacle, Harlem was a stage. It was its own planet, from the way people dressed to the way they talked. Even with all their influence, the black residents of Harlem didn't own Harlem. Clubs, businesses, and homes were privately owned by landlords who often overcharged their black tenants. Because of predatory practices throughout New York City, Harlem was flooded with black residents who couldn't get housing anywhere else, and slumlords took advantage. Desperate working-class black renters were often charged 200% more than white renters. The same practices that allowed these slumlords to charge more also allowed them to do less, and lots of buildings in Harlem fell into despair. By the end of the Civil Rights Movement, less than half of the housing in Harlem was considered safe. Our next black town has become the standard of black enterprise, and an unfortunate example of the measures people will take to stomp out black excellence. Sitting up at number 1, Greenwood, Oklahoma, 1921. Nothing is more synonymous with black cohesiveness and self-determination than these words: Black Wall Street. At the birth of a new century, many African Americans made their way toward Oklahoma. It was a land grab that attracted many black people with the hopes of building a firewall between them and Jim Crow segregation. A small section of Tulsa, Oklahoma became known as Little Africa, and is where the seeds of black industry were planted. Word of this burgeoning black town made its way to Booker T. Washington, who visited in 1905. He was impressed with what he saw. Mr. Washington encouraged them to focus on growth, continued to cooperate among themselves, and encouraged them to expand their enterprise into a 4,000-acre strip. Under the guidance of Booker T. Washington, that 4,000-acre strip became Greenwood Avenue. Greenwood Avenue would be the home of black-owned grocery stores, retail shops, libraries, and even banks. Greenwood Avenue would be known forever as Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street became a bustling district that attracted black doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs. Black families who came to Tulsa just looking for an opportunity turned their desperation into wealth. Some bought land and developed on it. Entrepreneurs like J.B. Stratford and O.W. Gurley opened their own hotel, while others opened barbershops and churches. But as we've seen thus far, when black prosperity and independence flourish on one side, resentment and jealousy burns hotter on the other. At its pinnacle, Black Wall Street was home to 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, numerous nightclubs and churches, and most of Tulsa's 10,000 black residents lived there. They established solidarity by electing their own leadership, and most importantly, they funded their own economic growth. On May 30th, 1921, a young black shoe shiner entered an elevator operated by a young white woman. The stories of what actually happened during that moment are conflicting, but what happened as a result is not. Here are the facts. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, walked on an elevator operated by a young white 17-year-old woman named Sarah Page. Allegedly, someone heard a scream and found Sarah in a distraught state. However, news headlines the next day claimed a black man had sexually assaulted a white woman, and for that charge, that meant imminent death for Dick Rowland. In order to protect him, police placed the young man in protective custody on the top floor of the police station. As rumors of what happened between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page spread, mobs of vengeful white men descended on the police station, demanding the police chief turn over Rowland in order to be taught a lesson. The black residents of Tulsa also got word of the incoming threats, and in response, they too went to the police station to defend against a potential takeover. And that is when the gunpowder finally ignited. A white man demanded an armed black man hand over his firearm. He refused. A tussle ensued, and one shot rang off, leaving the white man wounded. In retaliation, the mob retrieved their own weapons while others ransacked local businesses in search of weapons. The mob had swelled to 2,000 white men, mostly armed, and were met by a few dozen armed black men. The first battle began on the outskirts of Greenwood District and left 10 white men and 2 black men gunned down. The firefight raged on through the night, consequently spilling over onto Black Wall Street. This prompted some residents to take up arms, others to hide and flee. The angry mob began to set fires to property as they looted and destroyed local black-owned businesses. Tulsa fire trucks showed up, but were threatened if they helped put out any of the blazes. They retreated, and the fires engulfed the district. As the bullets rang out, an attack from above came down. Dozens of planes carrying assailants and firebombs flew over, causing even more death and structural damage. It took days for the smoke to clear. In the end, upwards 200 dead black bodies were recovered. Black Wall Street reduced to ashes.